the subject of our workshop series is emerging and re-emerging energy superpowers. So we will put on every workshop, and then with studies and with additional workshops in the various countries, we will have a closer look to a few selected countries which have an interesting profile when it comes to energy questions. And we have made the decision to start with Iran, which has an enormous potential. We will have the next workshop, 20th of April, on Kazakhstan. And for this we have made a cooperation with Nazarbayev University of Kazakhstan. We will also write a study for them on Kazakhstan and EU, what is the potential for cooperation. And we will present that study written by someone from Kazakhstan and someone from here. We will present that in Astana in the fall or at the end of this year. So we have started with the Kazakhs and Nazarbayev University a cooperation with a very concrete project. Also here we have not only funds from Nazarbayev University, but also from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation to make that possible. Then we will continue in July with a workshop on Iraq, and there also discussed Arbil and Kurdistan and Baghdad, the relationship between the two. Also here we have a cooperation with a newly set up center in Baghdad, funded by the EU. It's an EU Iraqi energy center, and we will have that most probably in the 14th or the 15th of July. Then we will continue in October with a workshop on Brazil, and in December with a workshop on China. And so we continue these workshop series, and I want to express my gratitude to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and also to the Institute of Strategic Dialogue here in London for the ongoing close cooperation and their support for our program. Today it's Iran, and I'm very happy to be able to introduce to you two speakers whom I value very much. First of all, Alistair Burt, Member of Parliament. We have known each other since, I would say, almost 20 years, perhaps even longer, I don't know. Very fast after the end of the division of Europe, we started. Were you in Czech Republic when we had this workshop with the very early on in Kalina? Yeah. We met when I was an MP in Germany, and Alistair was an MP in common workshops. And I'm particularly fond of him because he's one of those among the Tories who is very pro-Europe. And everybody who has followed our seminars and discussions know how important we value this European connection of Britain. Britain belongs to Europe.
3 of us in the Conservative Party.
So we're very happy. Well, Alistair has entered Parliament for the first time in '83. Since 2001, he represents North East Bedfordshire. Following a lengthy and varied front bench career in both government and opposition, Alistair was Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office between May 2010 and October 2013. And his responsibility was counter-terrorism, counter-proliferation, arms trade treaty negotiations, the Middle East, North Africa. So he is, I think, an expert to ask how is it going with Iran? What is his opinion about the negotiation process? Will we see a lifting of sanctions? And what does that mean in the future for developing Iran's enormous potential for the world and for, of course, for itself, for the country and its people? And as much as I value Alistair, I think we have a great opportunity to welcome Professor Jonathan Stern from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, a very well-known expert, I would say, on gas mainly. Gas is your obsession and is your main field. All your books are about, well, not all of them, but most of them, and are about gas and gas prices, very much about Russia. You are the speaker for the EU-Russia Gas Advisory Council since 2011. You have been, you were the founder of the Oxford Energy Institute?
No, the gas program, not the institute.
Oh, the gas program, the gas program, that's true, in 2003. And then, well, you're in international bodies. We have met last time, I think, in Essen at a conference. So I think we have a great expert on gas. How does this Iran, with its huge potential, how will that affect international gas markets? For instance, if they will come up with LNG trains, a plan that they have for a long time, but due to sanctions, due to mismanagement, we're not able to realize. How will that change the world of gas? But also when it comes to oil, we know that the sanctions have led to a situation where oil revenues in Iran in just 2 years were cut by half. So it is a disastrous situation in Iran. I've been traveling myself to Iran in the last 2 years 3 times, and I find that my feeling was that it's not only cosmetic that Mr. Rouhani, President Rouhani, is trying. He's really very clear on that he wants a nuclear deal and that he wants an end of the sanction. He knows it's necessary to bring Iran out of the isolation, and I think we have a great chance in the next weeks, I would say, to reach an agreement. Probably we have to do it before the American presidential election comes into a decisive phase. There is a window of opportunity now. Is there one? We will use that window of opportunity, and what does that mean for the future of gas and oil, but also for renewables? I was present when the first solar park in Iran was opened. It's only 0.5 megawatt. Nevertheless, close to Tehran, it was an interesting, symbolic, more than symbolic move. And there is also an enormous potential when it comes to renewables for Iran. Not to speak about energy efficiency, fighting flaring. Iran flares as much gas today as Azerbaijan produces. So there's a lot to do for European companies, for American companies, in cooperation with Iran in the years to come, if we use that chance. And then we have 2 commentators. 3 commentators. Frank Umbach, I don't have to present him for the 50th time here. Everybody knows him, his publications. He's our research director at EUCERS, and 2 younger scholars whom I will introduce later for their comments. I'm grateful also to both of you that you were able to come. Well, I would like to start our discussion with the Member of Parliament. Again, Alistair, welcome to EUCERS. The floor is yours.
Friedbert, thank you very much indeed for this opportunity. Sorry. Technical stuff done first. Thank you very much to spend an afternoon with you talking about one aspect of what I now consider to be one of the most enjoyable parts of my work, that is the engagement with the Middle East, which stems from long interest in Parliament, but more particularly my appointment as Minister for the Middle East just after the last election here in 2010. It saw me working to William Hague as Foreign Secretary during the period, commonly known as the Arab Spring, with everything that involves and all the ongoing ramifications of that. Truly privileged to be in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office at such an extraordinary period of time, which is not an event, but is a change in the nature of the Arab world, and we will not see the full ramifications of it for many years to come. It's a pleasure to be at King's, where my son graduated a few years ago with a first-class honours degree in American Studies, so thank you, King's. He is, of course, now a theatre director. That's how you use your degrees, kids, so thanks for that. But it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm, like everyone else, I'm fascinated by Iran and looking forward to seeing a little bit more of it. As some of you will be aware, the United Kingdom's relationships with Iran have been somewhat testy since they burnt down our embassy towards the end of 2010. I was the minister responsible for Iran at the time, so it was one of those portfolio places I was not able to visit during my period. But I do have the distinction of being, I think, the only current former minister to have formally expelled people from the United Kingdom, because while Mr Hague was making the announcement in the House of Commons as our aeroplane bearing our diplomats who had nothing left but the clothes they stood up in to fly home, I had the chargé d'affaires and his team in my office, where I read them a small statement which included the phrase, "I am expelling you from the United Kingdom." So there's not many times you get to do that. But in the circumstances, it was entirely justified. Nothing personal, purely professional, and I'm delighted that now, as the chairman of the Inter-Parliamentary Union in the House of Parliament, I will be welcoming the first Iranian parliamentary delegation to the United Kingdom since that period, that will be arriving in a couple of weeks' time in Parliament to begin, or at least to take a little bit further, the inevitable healing process that must go on when nations have their difficulties, but realise that we all ultimately have to live together. So that's a little bit of my background. What I would like to do, and I will only take a few minutes, I'm conscious that there's others to speak, and if this workshop is to do its job, I know there's a lot of guests who have a great deal to contribute, and a lot in areas where I'm deficient. So I will do the pure politics. What I would like to do is take up Friedbert's invitation and sketch out how politically the United Kingdom currently sees Iran, therefore in relation to the obstacles, the challenges, the opportunities of its re-emergence in the world. First and foremost then, I want to talk about identity, because much of Iran remains mysterious, partly because the Iranian government in particular is very careful in keeping a layer of mystery about it, what it may or may not be doing. And partly also because we think there is a genuine clash going on within Iran for its identity, for what Iran is going to emerge 30 odd years post the revolution. Is it still a post-revolutionary society? Has it settled into something different? It was a religious revolution, but those who go to Iran frequently and know it well know that Iran is not particularly a religious country. Has it become a survivalist regime which uses the revolution partly to keep people in power who have become ingrained with keeping in power? We know from everything we know about the social composition of Iran and Iranians, they're externally facing. They like the world, they like the connection with the world. The idea that they are somehow excluding themselves and they regard the world with great terror as people out to get them is not true of the Iranian people as a whole. It may be true of certain in the regime, but not of the Iranian people as a whole. So what Iran is going to emerge in order to take part in the modern world? To some extent, the nuclear discussions reflect this, because what they're about is whether or not Iran wishes to use its influence by taking part in a structured world where people have responsibilities as well as rights, where there are laws that govern people's conduct, and it wishes to exercise its influence by being part of that and recognizing that there may be some constraints on its activity, but in return for those constraints there's a great deal that it can do. Or does it want to remain some sort of bandit regime where it exercises its influence not by being part of a structure of other people at all, but actually by being a counterpoint to that structure, and it believes it offers greater influence through doing just that? And the internal discussions going on in Iran at the moment about what sort of nuclear deal there should be, indeed whether there should be a nuclear deal at all, reflect that sense of what sort of country it's going to be. So the first thing we have to consider when we're looking at the re-emergence of Iran is, what Iran are we going to see? Secondly, what's it going to bring to the table? This is an energy-based conference, and there are people in this room far better versed than I am to talk about the energy detail of Iran. But the politician dealing with Iran knows that in terms of leverage and power, Iran has got something pretty special. It's got what Professor Stern, it's got the world's largest reserves of gas and the fourth largest reserves of discovered oil. It's a major player on the energy scene, which is going to bring benefit to the world and to itself. As Friedbert was saying, all our understanding at present is that this power is far from being realized. It's not just a question of the sanctions, it's a question of the technology over years. It's not got the most modern technology in order to bring out what's there. There's an over-reliance on Russian and Chinese technology of the past, which is not going to be good enough in developing these fields and these resources for the future. In order to exploit them further, it's got to be more advanced, it's got to be part of a world that's out there in order to get the technology into it. And that clearly presents a great opportunity for the country that's prepared to do what is necessary in order to come back into the world. It has a tremendous source of leverage and power and opportunity sitting there ready to be used. Will it ally that to a modern economy? Well, again, I come back to what I said about the people themselves. Everything we know about the Iranian people is that they're inventive. They are very much in tune with modern technology, much to their government's concern, as they investigate the corners of the internet and find out the information they need to know, whatever the government may be telling them. And these are people who have a tremendous and inventive capacity and are absolutely tailor-made to take part in the Middle East that needs them. We know that despite the political drivers to revolution and change in the past few years, probably a more important driver has been the economic one. The region is one which needs a vast number of new jobs in the next couple of decades in order to satisfy the growth needs of their populations, and particularly young people. Unless the economies of the Middle East pick up, then the problems of young people with nothing to do, which we have seen right throughout the region, are going to become still greater. Iran, of course, socially wrestles with an awful lot of this. It wrestles with drugs in a big way. It wrestles with that sense of isolation that's seeped through to young people who want more from the world than they're currently being offered. A modern economy can make those opportunities happen. But for that to happen, that identity question that I raised at the beginning has got to be answered in a positive and affirmative way in relation to people having more freedom and more latitude in order to live the lives they want and make sure that their country reflects that. Recent discussion internally about whether or not the two opposition leaders held captive since the fraudulent elections of 2009 are going to be released is part of that discussion. So we'll see. in terms of the identity crisis, whether it can ally itself with the opportunities presented both through energy and through the development of a modern economy. But if those two things are tricky enough, the third issue I want to raise is where it sits within its region. Because it's not just a question of looking at the re-emergence of Iran as a state on its own. It's the Iran which has been heavily engaged in the affairs of its neighbours, and not always to everybody's best interest. I have to be extremely blunt. This is a regime that sponsors and supports terrorism in the region, and supports the unsettling and the pressure on other regimes and countries in the region for its own self-interest. It's responsible for a great deal of the pain and discomfort that the region sees, not exclusively, but it plays its part. It's going to have to work out, again, in coming back to that question of identity, it's going to have to work out where it wants to see its influence. If it wishes to see its influence measured in propping up a dictator such as Assad, waging war on his own people, if it wishes to be associated with that, fine, that puts it in one particular camp. But if it's going to address the concerns of the world for what it's been doing in Syria, it's got to change. It's become a trite phrase to say that Tehran now controls a number of capitals within the region: Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, and probably now Sana'a. How's it going to use that influence? In Iraq, for example, the efforts of Iraq to try and bring itself together, to realize, of course, the extraordinary resources that Iraq has, to counter the problems in Iraq that date back for many years, and we know there's plenty of causes, and no one sitting in my seat can be entirely lacking in blame for circumstances that have pertained in Iraq post 2003. But in an effort to overcome those and find a unified country, what part is Iran playing in trying to help the divisions in Iraq heal and ensure that, for instance, the Sunni community in Iraq feels that they have a place, and therefore there is a purpose and a reason for them in joining in fighting together so-called ISIL, Daesh, that now threatens so many within the region? For it must be true to say that the Sunni community do not really quite feel that. And that's one of the reasons why the world and the region cannot get a grip on this wicked ideology, because it actually has rather more backing than we'd all like to believe. What part is Iran playing in trying to help that? It's all very well to fight people, but what part are they playing in trying to bring the separate parts of Iraq together? Lebanon, you will know as well as I do, an uneasy peace maintained there, quite remarkably in relation to what's happened in Syria, but still a government which cannot function, a state which cannot function without the support and acquiescence of Hezbollah, with its control from outside its borders. What part is Iran going to play in the future of Lebanon? Bahrain, again, a state of much interest to all, clearly a strong influence from Saudi, and what part are the Iranians playing in the difficulties that are already part of Bahrain but not helped by external influence? And Yemen, we know about in recent times, the change in the nature of Yemen, the Houthi takeover in Sana'a, and again, to what part is Iran responsible for that, and to what extent might Iran become an opportunity for a regional proxy conflict? My next point being, of course, the role and the part played by Iran, not only in those individual areas within the Middle East, but how they sit within the wider conflicts, Arab and Persian, Sunni and Shia, in terms of great power interests as well. So Iran is not only going to work out what is its true identity, it's not only got to work out within the nuclear equation whether it sticks to the rules of the rest of the world, and by doing so gains re-entry and uses its influence. It's also got to work out within the region what sort of power does it want to be and what sort of influence does it want to exert. And all these issues are part of the tension within the diffuse leadership within Iran. Nobody in Westminster or Whitehall is in any way naive about the complexity of leadership and power in Iran. It's not a simple structure, it's a complex structure in which many people play a part. And it is in many ways highly democratic, as lots of people get involved in the conversations about what may happen. We're very conscious of that as well. But what ultimately are decisions? What decisions are going to be made about that future? And then the final conundrum, if I may say, for just a second, of course, is what do other people expect of Iran? For the last couple of years, I've been asking in the region, for example, what sort of Iran does Saudi want to see? What sort of Iran does the United States want to see? We're all very comfortable with pantomime villains. We know where they are. When you can put people in a box neatly, it's great. And when a state fulfills the vision of being a problem, we're all very comfortable with it in some way. But what happens when that box opens and something new emerges? What are people going to be comfortable with then? And I'm not sure that I've actually found an answer to that question, either from other big players within the region or from external players like the United States. Again, we all know the trite version, both the United States and Iran need each other as an enemy. Perhaps Israel needs Iran as an enemy more than anyone else at the moment. Sorry, I should rephrase that. Perhaps the current Prime Minister of Israel needs Iran as an enemy more than anyone else does at the moment. But when that trap is sprung and there's a different sort of Iran, what sort of Iran are people going to be comfortable with? What do they really want to see? And what would a re-emerged Iran that's decided to take its part in the affairs of nations, stick to the rules and seek to influence, what impact will that have on some of the regional balances and battle lines that have been drawn up in recent years? What impact will this have on changing those lines and making people think again? So, million questions, no answers, but it's a bit of a mystery, but it's a fascinating country, and I hope I've just set out some of the politics that we think about in Westminster as we take this forward.
Well, thank you very much for this very comprehensive picture, political picture that you gave us, and that you shared with us so frankly the thoughts that you definitely have in the British government and Parliament about Iran and what it means if it comes out of that isolation. So thank you for the broader picture. I think with Jonathan we will now hear perhaps more concerning the energy front. What really would happen if Iran would get that chance? How is it a game, and to what extent is it a global game changer?
Well, thank you very much, and pleasure to be here. It's my first time here, so I'm very happy to have been invited. My only regret is that Elham Hassanzadeh, who was intending to be here, unfortunately for a variety of reasons, couldn't be. What I want to talk about mainly is gas, and I will add a very few words about oil at the end, although in some ways, in terms of their importance for the global energy balance, oil is the more important fuel. What I wanted to say to start with is I'm going to summarise Elham's book, which we published last year, which is called Iran's Natural Gas Industry in the Post-Revolutionary Period. And the subtitle is important. It's Optimism, Skepticism and Potential. And all of those three apply to Iran in almost equal measure, whatever you have to say about the country. My claim for summarising this book is it comes from her doctoral thesis, which I supervised, and then brought her to our institute, where she turned it into a book and published it. But having said that, I'm sorry she's not here. I have to say that I'm enormously glad and surprised to see David Jalilvand, who I did a similar thing for his thesis, and we published that about a couple of years ago. So in some ways there's an element of continuity here. As the Minister has said, everybody always starts with Iran's immense resource potential. To give this to you in a context, I'm very happy to tell you that nobody now remembers a paper that I published in 1975 in which I forecast that by 2000 Iran would be the biggest gas exporter in the world, far bigger than the former Soviet Union. I didn't necessarily expect to be right about that in 2000, but I could not possibly have foreseen that by 2000 Iran would be a net gas importer. Now this gives you a sense of how completely things can be turned on their heads, and how, although resources are of course enormously important, we should not overstate their importance. Essentially, the situation with Iran is that this country is a natural gas superpower, and we in Oxford who deal with gas markets, we pay a great deal of attention to it in its own right. In other words, we are very interested by what's happening in Iran, not just the interaction between Iran and the rest of the world. There has been a massive increase in gas production in Iran. It is in fact, even taking into account US shale gas production, it has increased its production at the fastest rate of any country over the past 2 decades. The problem is that in so doing it has also increased demand at, if anything, an even faster rate. And this book talks about how that has happened, but the essence of the demand increase is about the subsidies in prices which have held prices down at very low levels. Now, Iran in 2008-9 introduced a very, very bold subsidy reduction program. And this is a program of actually very great importance for looking at the reduction of subsidies in the whole of the Middle East and North African region, which has a similar problem. For various reasons, due to exchange rates and inflation within the country, the subsidy reduction program has largely failed. It may still succeed in the future, but the demand problem, in fact, up until now, has removed most of the potential for Iran becoming a major exporter, or indeed an exporter of any significance. The country currently exports fairly modest amounts of pipeline gas to Turkey, and there have been significant problems with that, commercial problems with that relationship. It exports modest amounts to Armenia and to Azerbaijan in a gas power swap. Now, what one has to do, I think, looking to the future and asking, well, can this change? How can it change? On what timescale can it change? Is to look at the internal situation in Iran. And I say this because in Iran, throughout even the pre-revolutionary and certainly the post-revolutionary period, there is a political dynamic around gas exports, where a significant proportion of the elite are fundamentally opposed to gas exports, believing that gas should be reserved for the domestic economy. And Elham's book finds that this is actually economically very well founded. In other words, that if you look at the situation of try to do an economic analysis, which incidentally is very difficult because of lack of data, but if you try to do an economic analysis of what produces the biggest economic return from Iran's gas, you find that number one is re-injection of gas into oil fields. And the second is petrochemicals development. Only after those two have been satisfied, the question of domestic, that is residential consumption of gas, is complicated by the subsidies question. But certainly only after those two items that I've mentioned do you come to exports as an economically attractive source of revenues. So what should we expect? Well, if we assume that sanctions are quickly unravelled, and I'm expecting other people to discuss whether that is likely. But if we assume that sanctions are quickly unravelled, the view that this book takes, and which is, I think, supported by quite a lot of research, is that for the rest of this decade, and probably most of the next decade, we would expect Iranian gas exports to get no further than the region. For those of you who are not familiar with the history of this, Iran has a long history of gas export agreements, contracts, which have been signed with a large number of regional actors. Syria, Iraq, Oman, Pakistan. Mostly these have totally failed for a mixture of commercial and political reasons. We think in general that probably the most promising ones today are the exports to Iraq and the exports to Pakistan, where the infrastructure is largely in place. Whether these will happen, how quickly they will happen, how large they will get, is a question in our minds, partly because the situation in the importing countries is problematic. What else could be expected? Well, once we get 10 years of, as it were, renovation in the Iranian gas industry, with some significant foreign technology, but I don't want to overstate this because I, in general, have a high regard of what the Iranians have achieved with no foreign technology and equipment. But there is no doubt that with at least a modest amount of this technology and equipment, they would do better. Of course, in order to do that, there would have to be an adjustment of the terms and conditions which are given to foreign companies, and that also is a subject that the Rouhani administration has been addressing, although I do not, perhaps other people in the room do, I do not know of the details of any details in the New Deal. But clearly the whole buyback regime was not successful for reasons that probably people understand better than me. So, to try to draw the gas situation to a close, my proposition to you is that for the next decade and perhaps a little bit longer, one might expect a modest, not massive, but a modest expansion of exports to the immediate region. Post 2030, we could expect, if the subsidy program has been successful, if production is beginning to outstrip demand to a significant extent, exports beyond the region. Then the question would be, would liquefied natural gas exports be more attractive to Tehran than exports of pipeline gas through a very long pipeline to Europe? One can argue this both ways. My feeling is that by the 2030s, the liquefied natural gas market will be so far developed compared with what it is now that this is something that Iran will want to participate in. But one could also argue, well, they already have the pipeline to Turkey. Turkey will become a major route to Europe, therefore they could feed into that route. One can argue this different ways. But not until 2030 does this book, and indeed the rest of our work, see enough gas surplus in Iran to make a major difference to any sort of game changer to the global gas market, or indeed any of the regional gas markets. Let me close by saying just a few words on oil, about which I know much less, and saying that there is in the minds of our oil people at the Institute, there is a technical question which we have not really managed to resolve in any satisfactory way, which is it the case that gas needs to be re-injected into the aging oil fields in very large quantities? Or would it be possible for some other agent to create a similar re-injection outcome for oil? Now, the Iranian geologists, hopefully that's not a gunship approaching us, the Iranian geologists believe that natural gas re-injection is the only technical solution to limestone carbonate reservoirs. I'm not a technical person, I don't know. But if it was to be the case that modern advanced foreign technology could achieve major increases in a recovery from the oil fields without massive gas reinjection, that would significantly change the gas picture because it would free up a lot of gas that we currently see being reinjected. The only other thing I have to add is that in many respects I regard the lifting of the sanctions as much more important for oil production than for gas production. These are old oil fields, and we know that through fairly advanced gas reinjection and water flooding techniques, you can substantially increase recovery. We know the industry is suffering from a shortage of spare parts. So this, it seems to me, is potentially where the immediate impact of the lifting of sanctions could be more significant for global oil supplies. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you also for a great presentation, and let me come back to the book and once more introduce it. Ilham has already been here at a workshop that we had a few months ago, and she is very unhappy that she couldn't make it, but she had a great promoter of her book, and please hear everybody who wants to get it, the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies will be happy to provide.
Indeed.
We come to Frank. Frank, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me just add a few points for the discussion. Let me begin by making the point in respect to the sanctions, and I think in adding what Alistair Burt has said. So the public discussion is very much focused on lifting the sanctions immediately or not. We had this discussion already last summer, and for some reasons, as we all know, the lifting of sanctions had not been taking place. I think from my own perspective, originally coming rather from the foreign policy field, and having some insights in the discussion and respecting of those sanctions versus Iran for many years, and looking to the internal discussion in the US, particularly also in a Republican-dominated Senate, I suggest even in a more optimistic scenario, you cannot, or maybe we should not expect that all sanctions will be lifted immediately. I think the more realistic scenario might be that a gradual lifting of sanctions as kind of a process where Iran needs to take, of course, some steps. In return, we may lift some of the sanctions, then waiting on further steps on the Iranian side would be probably a more realistic scenario. And I'm mentioning that because of the very much heated debates we had last year in regard to the Ukraine conflict and whether Iranian gas resources could be an additional diversification source. I think the expectation that Iran could turn from overnight to a major exporter of gas to Europe, that scenario is against that debate of lifting the sanctions, needs to be taken into account. And in this respect, I would very much follow what Professor Stone has already said. And in addition, coming more to the Iranian energy sector, let me just add few additional points which make clear that even if you would assume a lifting of sanctions even immediately, there are definitely a number of regulatory, economic, financial and other factors which will lead to a situation where Iranian gas exports or increasing gas exports need certainly some time. I think most of the experts I have spoken and seen in the debates expect that larger Iranian gas exports will, and also oil exports, will take place after approximately another 5 years. So probably not before 2020. And as I said, this is even based on a number of rather positive conditions which need to be met, particularly on the Iranian side. Just looking to gas and then also some remarks to the oil sector in Iran. In general, the potential is there, as we have already heard. Iran has the largest or second largest proven gas reserves in the world, the fourth largest oil reserves. And we have already heard the situation in respect of gas, where on one hand the production has tremendously increased, on the other hand the demand and consumption reaching almost the same time the level of the production. So even at the present stage, over winter time, where you have a peak demand of gas consumption in Iran, you have a situation where very often the demand peak can even not be fulfilled by the production. So there are shortages, temporary shortages, which Iran has to face, which makes it even more difficult if you think upon what Professor Stern has already said in respect of also more the recent export agreements which had been signed with Iraq and Oman. Whether a pipeline to Oman can be built, whether other conditions need to be met. The fact is that even in this short-term perspective by the year 2016, where those exports should take place, there are very much doubts whether Iran can even implement those agreements with Iraq and Oman, particularly during the winter time, because of the peak demand of gas consumption at home. In respect, and then that leads also to the wider debate. I think Iran is not a monopolistic player. My own experiences going back to a visit also of 2008, where we had at an annual conference on Eurasia organized every year by the Iranian Foreign Ministry. My impression was there are a lot of different schools of thought and vested interests, where you have of course a clear interest in at least parts of the industry and parts also of the foreign ministry, which were very much looking forward to exports. But you have other industrial players and also domestic players, as we have already heard, which have no interest at all at exports. And when I'm looking to those debates with various interests and players inside Iran, it reminds me very much to the very similar debates we have today in the United States. In respect to the potential LNG exports, whether they should use it economically, whether really the US economy will benefit and to which extent, or whether they will not, and whether it's better for the industry to export. Just looking to the prices, in average, the gas prices, Iran has to pay domestically is a little bit more than 3 cents per cubic meter. For export in average, it's certainly more than 45. So I think there will be definitely an interest, partly in the government and in the industry, which will definitely favor exports. But as we have also heard, there are other players which are against that. So also in this respect, from the political vested interest combination of political forces, I think one should not overestimate the exports, at least not in the short and midterm future. Interestingly, the situation in the oil sector is not so optimistic as it looks like at the first glance. And that has to do that 80% of Iran's operating oil fields are already in the second half life. And that means that we have here a factor where energy efficiency, production efficiency comes into the play. And that factor, I think, in the future will definitely become a more important factor. Particularly at the present stage of the oil and gas markets, where the competition is definitely very much increasing and where efficiency is an increasing important factor in that worldwide competition. And that brings me also to the point, the oil factor is something which is, of course, at the moment something which the government has to take very much into account, as the Iranian oil exports have already decreased before the falling oil prices. Yeah? If you take the figures, 2013, the oil export revenue have decreased to a little bit more than 62 billion US dollars. 2012 they were still already at 102 billion still, and in 2011 it was 150 billion. You can imagine what that means against the falling oil prices, which have decreased by 60% last summer, and the Iranian state budget, which had originally been calculated with a level of definitely more than 150 US dollar per barrel of oil. Some argue it was definitely even higher. So against that background, I think the oil factor is not something which should be overestimated here in the same way. And having probably talked already too much, but I think David will definitely, or can definitely more go in detail about the domestic constellation of those forces and the different kind of schools we have here, which is very often a non-transparent debate, both on the political level, but I think even on the industrial level, which makes it for us from outside so difficult to assess the situation.
Thank you so much, Frank. I now turn to brief comments of two other distinguished speakers. Please concentrate, both of you, on issues that have not been raised. So we know now that the export potential is not as big as some people believe, that it's more enhanced oil recovery and other. So try to look at points that have not been mentioned, or mention points where you completely disagree. I would like to start with Kalina Damianova. Kalina is here at EUCERS as a Konrad Adenauer Foundation Fellow. She is writing just now a study on Iran as a re-emerging energy superpower. She holds an MA in International Peace and Security of King's College, so she's one of us, and we're happy to have you here. Kalina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First, I would like to use the opportunity to thank Professor Pflüger for giving me the chance to say a few words about the research that I'm conducting here at EUCERS, and also to thank the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for supporting my study. Much has already been said, and I see everyone agrees that the exports might not start in a couple of decades, so I would like to focus on the preconditions for something to happen. So it's undoubtedly a fact that due to internal and international political, security and even economic factors, the vast energy potential that Iran has and the geostrategic location that allows Iran to export both to the growing energy markets in Asia and to Europe have been blocked. But I would say that two are the major forthcoming blocking factors, one of which being the international sanctions, and the second one being the oil contracts that are unfavorable to the international oil companies. And I remember that last year on the event that we had here on Iran, Professor Pflüger called for the international community to give Iran a chance. And now, almost a year later, the international sanctions and reaching the permanent agreement remains the key and foremost precondition for the development of the energy sector. But with the Iranian authorities announcing the preparation of new contracts, the so-called integrated petroleum contract, the second question also gains key significance: to what extent those contracts will be more favorable to the oil companies, and will they address the gravest shortcomings that the buyback contracts had in a satisfactory manner to the oil companies in order to attract them. And this time we can put it another way around: to what extent Iran will give a chance to the international private sector, because we know that in Iran there have been those conflicting tendencies in terms of oil contracts. On the one hand side, the lacking modernization Iranian energy sector and the need of improvement have been a sincere motivation for the Iranian authorities to create a more attractive oil and legal regime to the foreign companies in order to attract some more foreign investment. But on the other hand, we have also another tendency which is probably even stronger, which is the Iranian historically created reluctance to grant access to the foreign companies in their energy sector, because it is a matter very sensitive to the Iranians. So the previous, or the present, I would say, buyback contracts have been a result of those two tendencies, and hence they have become, they are not very favorable to the oil companies. Hence Iran lacks investment. So questions that are going to be forthcoming and of interest is to what extent the new terms will actually give the chance to the oil companies to enter the Iranian energy sectors. That's why the research that I'm doing also focuses on that in more detail. However, acknowledging that change in the legal system is a first step towards huge progress, but I would say that this is only the first step, and the substantial progress comes when there is stable implementation of the law. So in Iran, in the domestic environment in Iran, the international private sector has other difficulties and challenges, some of them stemming from the complicated political structure that creates a level of insecurity, and to the international private sector, the stable business environment is one of crucial importance. Of course, the study goes beyond and analyzes what are the potentials of the energy sector in Iran, what are the obstacles in the energy sector in Iran, as well as it attempts to track down the possible export strategy, which is the issue that is of key interest to the European Union, to which diversification is now central. And of course, this entails another very major issue, which is the dilemma which the European Union now faces, because deepening energy relations with Iran might also entail security and political outcomes, given sometimes controversial position that Iran has in the Middle East and on its domestic level. So finally, of course, the research attempts to track down the possible implications, geostrategic and economic, for Europe, as we want to see the European point of view as well. And since the study wants to attempt to analyze everything into the most up-to-date dynamic, that's why the event here and the speakers and their statement will be incorporated in the study and greatly contribute to its authenticity. And probably just to add some words to conclude, I have been following the Iranian case for a couple of years now, and this year on the conferences that I have been or listened to or read about, I hear the word acceptance being said more and more, and Iran being accepted as an emerging power, as a ascending power. And now we're discussing Iran under the theme Re-Emerging Energy Superpowers, and it is undoubtedly that Iran has a huge energy potential, but I would like to also say that, in my opinion, power always entails responsibility, and when we talk about powers, we should always question how this responsibility actually can and will contribute to the peace and stability. Otherwise, power is meaningless. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kalina. I would like to draw your attention to Kalina's article in the new edition of our EUCERS newsletter, Iran, Energy Security and the EU. Thank you for your input here, and good luck with your study. And then we have a last speaker, last comment from David Jalilvand. He is presently writing his PhD at the Berlin Center for Caspian Region Studies on energy and Iranian political economy. He has written quite extensively on Iran and gas and energy. He has studied in Moscow, in Erfurt, now in Berlin, is an expert on Iran. The only disadvantage in his CV is that he got his master's not at KCL but at LSE, but we forgive that. And
thank you very much for allowing me in the first place. I'm very happy to have the chance to also share my thoughts with you on this matter, and I have to apologize in the beginning. Some of my points will be along the lines of what Jonathan has just said. That's maybe because I've worked with him. I learned a lot from him, but I'll also add a few points perhaps in the latter part of my presentation. I'll focus also mostly on the gas side, although some of the points also apply to oil, but I think natural gas is more relevant with regards to the debates in Europe, especially with regards to the situation now vis-à-vis Russia and the search for alternatives to Russia, which at least some in Europe are looking for. We already learned that there are quite a few difficulties involved with regards to Iranian natural gas, and the major question, the major theme I think which accompanies us here is what can we expect? And as was said already earlier, there is substantial potential with regards to Iranian natural gas. Iran is holding the world's largest reserves. It has comparably low production costs. Moreover, Iran is at a geographical position which positions itself at the crossroads of various supply and demand centers, starting from Europe, the Caucasus, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, the Arab Middle East, and then also through access to the sea, Iran could reach the Asian LNG market. So Iran could not only become a major producer and exporter potentially, but also act as a hub for the transit of gas from Central Asia, from the Caucasus to other parts of the world. Having said that, we already learned that there are a few difficulties involved, and Iran has, with only limited foreign support, more than doubled its natural gas production the past decade, which is quite an achievement, I'd say. At the same time, it's at a level of 166 BCM per year, which is substantially below the production level of countries like Russia or the United States. So there is still some way to go for Iran to play in that league. Sanctions did have a negative effect on investments and on the development of the Iranian upstream capabilities. This is especially problematic when Iran looks at Qatar and sees how Qatar has gotten support from international companies, and now there is gas moving from the Iranian side of the shared South Pars field to the Qatari side. So there are some issues that Iran is facing in this regard. And on the demand side, Iran has experienced massive demand growth in its country, related to a growth of population, to economic growth, and also to overconsumption in response to the subsidies that were also mentioned already. Moreover, making things even more complicated, there is a policy in Iran to switch the domestic energy mix, and in the early 2000s natural gas has actually taken over oil as the primary domestic energy carrier, and there are good reasons for this. If you've ever been to Tehran and you see the smog-covered city, there is some incentives for the use of natural gas because it's more friendly in environmental terms, but also it leads to or contributes to economic growth. And it was mentioned that Iran is now basically basing its electricity production on natural gas. Natural gas is also used in other fields such as road transportation as a feedstock for the petrochemical industry, for re-injection, and also to large extent for the residential sector. And so there are a variety of uses for Iranian gas domestically. And so the question is it wise for Iran to change that policy? And if you now position yourself as a decision maker in Iran, or imagine yourself to be a decision maker in Iran, I think it's very hard to justify to your own people to export natural gas when frequently during peak demand in the winter months, certain customers have their gas supply cut. So the situation is so tense that every time in the winter, when especially residential consumption is high, for example, industry consumers have their supply cut, and this has led to intense debates domestically in Iran. And the Iranian Energy Minister Zanganeh has been brought to the parliament several times because of that. He had to justify why this is happening. And considering this situation, I think it's very difficult to argue for anyone inside of Iran to actually go forward with natural gas export. Having said that, there are, of course, constituents or people inside Iran who are advocating for natural gas exports, and for good reasons. And these people are mostly located in either the foreign policy circles or the National Iranian Gas or Oil Company. The first people are looking for strategic advantages, and indeed, if Iran would export natural gas, it would actually form ties with a series of countries, especially in the region, but possibly even beyond, and it would give these countries some incentives to have good relations with Iran. And that's a clear advantage. And if you also talk with foreign policy people with regards to European-Iranian relations, that's an argument you hear very often, that Iran will supply gas to Europe. And it makes sense from their point of view. Other people who are supportive of gas exports are people in the energy industry, in the oil company, in the gas company, because the returns are much higher when they export natural gas, and B, international customers have proven to pay on time, whereas domestic customers normally have delays and at the same time pay a lower price. On the other hand of the spectrum, people with an interest in the domestic arena of course are very, very skeptical with regards to exports. And if you speak to people from the Ministry of Industry and Mines and others, they don't think that exporting natural gas is a particularly good idea. Of course, having said all this, if sanctions go and if all of a sudden lots of foreign capital and technology pours into Iran, and Iran possibly follows the example of Qatar in the 1990s of rapidly improving its upstream capabilities, then the situation might change and Iran might be in a position both to supply the domestic market and export internationally. But having said that, there is some way to go, and I don't think this is something for the next 5 years or 10 years, but rather for the longer timeline. A final point perhaps on the budget, because I think $140 budget, I mean, these figures circulate in the media,
15,
or 115 whatsoever. I mean, it's a bit difficult because, for one, the share of oil and gas revenues in the domestic budget is only 30% of the current budget and will be 20% in the upcoming budget. So there is some room for adjustments. The second thing is that, of course, a state can also, delay certain expenditures, so there is room for maneuver. And another point is that there are a large series of companies inside Iran which do not pay taxes at all, or only at a very minimum level. And in fact, the upcoming budget for the new Iranian year starting in March 21st foresees that a series of these semi-governmental, semi-private companies will have to pay taxes, and the current budget or the new budget will be based on a barrel price of $72 per barrel with a share of 20% in the budget. So the effect is there, and it causes a lot of problems for Iran, but I don't think one should overestimate these difficulties for the Iranians in this regard. Having said all that, yes, I conclude again by saying that I don't think it's very likely to expect major volumes of Iranian natural gas in the global markets anytime soon. Possibly exports to Iraq will work, possibly to Oman, possibly to Pakistan, but that will be at a rather modest level compared to the scale of exports of countries like Russia and others. Thank you.